and welcome to our third talk of the day. Sorry, we're starting. Hi. Welcome to the first talk of the day. We are very, very fortunate to have John Kleinberg giving a talk at our workshop. John is truly somebody who needs no introduction. He's like a world expert, in both algorithms, algorithm design, and network science. He's written a seminal book, and he's the recipient of many, many prizes, including the famous Nevalina Prize. So we are truly fortunate to have him give a talk, and today he'll be talking about the challenge of understanding what users want. Thank you so much, John, and the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks very much for the invitation to take part in the workshop, and sorry that I'm not able to be there in person, but I hope to be out at Berkeley at some point in the future, in the near future. So and to see many of you out there. Okay, and I'm assuming the sound and everything is still working okay. Is that good? All right.
Good.
Great. Okay, so yeah, so what I wanted to talk about today was some work that Senthil Mullainathan and Manish Raghavan and I have been doing over the past 2 years or so, thinking about some questions related to modeling user behavior on social media, a kind of problem that I've certainly been thinking about for a long time, but with a particular focus on sort of things that we see happening at the moment on large social media sites, on YouTube, on Facebook, on Twitter, and to sort of think about the communication problem in effect that's happening, in which it feels as though users are on these sites, all of us are on these sites. Platforms are trying to sort of optimize for their experience, but somehow there's sort of this intuition that a lot of people express, that that you often read in the news media, that somehow the more platforms optimize, the less happy users seem to get with the experience, right? It feels like there's something working at cross purposes here. And so what might that be? And so I wanted to start with, sort of how we often think about social media when we go to think about models of this, which is, to emphasize the sort of social in social media, and to think about this is a place where we go to find out what people think about things, right? We go online because we're curious what people have to say about topics that we've seen going on. We want to, read news, we want to read people's reactions to news. And, and so we, often come across, headlines like this one, which I screenshotted in spring of 2016 while the 2016 Democratic primary was going on. It was on this blog called thepeoplesview.net, which I don't even know how I ended up at, since I don't think I've read it before or since. And it's an open letter to Matt Taibbi of Rolling Stone magazine. It's a brilliant response from a millennial to Matt Taibbi's displeasure over Rolling Stone's endorsement of Hillary Clinton. And so this is the kind of thing you find on social media. I screenshotted this one back in spring of 2016 because I felt like there was something sort of deliciously complicated about this. And the reason why it feels deliciously complicated is that this is not a story about Hillary Clinton. It's not even a story about Rolling Stone's endorsement of Hillary Clinton. No, it's actually, maybe it's about Matt Taibbi's displeasure over Rolling Stone's endorsement of Hillary Clinton, but actually it's not even that. It's really this brilliant response that a millennial apparently had to Matt Taibbi's displeasure. And think how effortlessly, your brain maps the cast of characters in that one sentence, right? This is very much what we do when we go onto social media, right? There's Hillary Clinton, there's Rolling Stone, Matt Taibbi had an opinion about Rolling Stone. The millennial had had an opinion about what Matt Taibbi said. But of course, you're not hearing from the millennial. That's not what you're doing. You're hearing from thepeoplesview.net. And we do this effortlessly, right? The reason why opinion dynamics on the internet feels complicated is because it is genuinely complicated, right? To even map out this one sentence involves me building a little network diagram. And of course, you're not reading the thepeoplesview.net. You're listening to me give a talk about this thing I read in thepeoplesview.net, right? So now, to the extent that you have an opinion on all of this, you're even more steps removed from what's going on here, right? So this is something that we know about media. Namely that it's not just about the content that we read there, but it's about the other people, both the interactions and also the conflicts between other people, right? So we've known this for a long time. At a workshop, not unlike this one that I went to at Columbia in 2004, although unlike this one, it did not have a virtual component. I had a series of really fascinating conversations. I felt very fortunate to meet Elihu Katz, one of the early scholars of mass communication from the middle of the 20th century. And we had an interesting conversation because Elihu Katz, with his mentor, Paul Lazarsfeld, one of the founders of the study of mass communication, had written this book, Personal Influence, in 1955, in which they were trying to make sense of the effect of disruptive technological change on the political process. For them, disruptive technological change was, TV and the radio. And in 2004, I was looking at blogging, and I was thinking about what I was convinced most surely was going to be the most contentious US presidential election that we were ever going to see, the Bush versus Kerry election of 2004. And we were discussing, the comparisons and the contrast between the kind of mass communication that they thought about in the 1950s and the kind of things that we were seeing with blogging in 2004. And in a way, starting in 2004, moving through blogging, through early social media, through online video sharing, through all of these things, I think, we've seen this kind of roadmap of research get mapped out, right, in which we formulate work on social media in terms of interactions and conflicts between people through things like the diffusion of innovation, through polarization, through misinformation, through recent work on, the search for radicalization pathways in social media, right? This idea that the conflict is taking place between people. I say this to kind of frame, how I arrived at the problems I'm going to be talking about today, because in a way, what sort of intrigued Sendel and Manish and me as we began thinking about, the state of social media and what we might try to say about it in the early 2000s, early 2020, looking both at our own experience, also talking to people at, the companies that were, working on these things, as we all know people at those companies, how it was not just about the interactions and the conflicts between distinct people. In a way, in order to really think about social media, we have to think about a second source of conflicts, the way in which social media creates conflicts within each of us individually, right? The way in which it actually generates internal conflict, and then somehow actually derives a lot of its complexity from how that internal conflict plays out as we consume social media. What do I mean by internal conflict? Like here, it's obvious what conflict between people is, right? We see arguments on social media. What do I mean by internal conflict? And I mean things that you, of course, will also recognize from, a whole set of parallel news headlines, right? In which, for example, we spend long periods of time during the day, doom scrolling through news about COVID and news about new variants, knowing it's making us nervous and unhappy, but somehow returning to do it and somehow not able to stop, right? We find people, not only seeking to leave social media, even people who are very active, right? People often get more and more active on a platform and then suddenly go sort of cold turkey, right? They suddenly announce, that's it, I'm stopping as of today, right? People even seek out advice, apparently, from, people with titles like professional internet quitter, someone who advises how to quit the internet. And we see sort of, questions thrown out to the Reddit community, like, how do I spend less time on YouTube? And if there weren't this growing line of research on these kinds of questions, you might think this was a remarkably easy question. The way to spend less time on YouTube is to not go to YouTube, right? And that tends to, you would think, solve the problem. But of course, we know it's much, much more complicated, right? And so if I think about sort of, this growing line of work over the last few years that's happening in the HCI community, in the online social media community, in empirical economics, in the theory of mass communication, people looking at, this sort of constellation of things, right? Which in some cases you could think of as digital addiction, but often it's sort of somewhere, milder than, you might call addiction, but sort of, overconsumption, regretful use of the platform, right? Sort of the sense in which that we spend more time than we want to, right? We go online, but we don't actually feel like we want to be there. In a way, there's yet another diagram going on, right? The Facebook quitting advice from a professional internet quitter is itself a little complicated story to think, right? It's about the part of you that wants to use Facebook and the conflict that has with the part of you that wants to override this urge to use Facebook. And in some sense, the professional internet quitter is sort of trying to help one side of you in its struggle against the other side of you, right? They're picking sides in a conflict, but that conflict is happening within yourself, right? And that's what this growing volume of research on overconsumption of social media is thinking about. And so as people, began looking at, more and more empirical work in this direction, right? So, looking at experiments, for example, in which we pay people not to use social media and then we measure their happiness afterwards, people in which we, introduce commitment devices, right? We say, what are some design features I might introduce that, whereby you can set timers and make sure that you don't spend more time than you want on these platforms. We thought it would be interesting to think about what might a model of this conflict look like, right? In the same way that we have models for conflicts between people on social networks, what might a model of this internal conflict look like? And for that, among the three of us, Manish and I, Sendel certainly has had by far the most practice thinking about some of these, behavioral biases, these internal conflicts. And one of the sort of key starting points is this, theme that's now become, fundamental to how people think about this in behavioral science, is the distinction between want and should, right? So this is the distinction between want and should. We see it, for example, in, food consumption, to draw an analogy with media consumption, that, you could be at, a party, a reception, a dinner, and, in front of you is a bowl of salad and a bowl of potato chips. And one part of you sort of knows which one you should be eating. And a different part of you perhaps is just, unreasonably tempted by the potato chips. And, and this is sort of in, stark contrast, the conflict that one sees. And of course, you also see this, not just with food, but to go back to our motivating example of media, people have also looked at empirical research on want versus should in consumption of media, right? So you were trying to decide what movie to watch, and you could watch, an Avengers movie, something loud and noisy, which is sort of immediately accessible, or you could watch, a thought-provoking documentary like this one on the Helvetica font, right? In which they point out that the cast of characters are the letters of the alphabet that you're all familiar with, and the movie is about Helvetica. Right, so this is a should movie. It would be good for you, but you'd have to actually decide to pick this one, rather than the other one. And this one advertises that you can start watching immediately with your public library card or university login. I suppose on the assumption that the only people who are conceivably going to watch this either have a library card or go to a university. So these are the kinds of things people think about when they think about the distinction between want and should. And I picked these two examples because actually each of them has been the subject of, quite interesting, not just lab studies, but actually field work, right? Empirical evidence that people, for example, consume want goods more in the more immediate term, and they consume should goods over the longer term, right? So, for example, the first, I'll mention two studies here, both by this trio, Katie Milkman, Todd Rogers, and Max Bazerman. So for food, that they looked at online grocery orders placed by the same households, where the delivery dates for different orders, were further out. Sometimes you wanted the groceries later that day or the next day. Sometimes you wanted them 3 days or 4 days in advance. And what they found was actually this, this very strong regularity, that when the date by which you were requesting the groceries was further in the future, they contained more should items, more things like salad. And when you were asking for things that were going to be arriving sooner, they contained more want goods, right? More like potato chips. Similarly, in the mail order DVD era, right? So when people actually, in things like the early days of Netflix, when you went and requested movies to come by mail on DVD, and then you played them, and then you mailed them back, and you maintained your Netflix queue. They looked at what you might call inversions, right? Where the same household orders movie A before movie B, but they return movie B before movie A, right? So there's kind of a LIFO kind of thing going on in the language of computer science, right? A comes in before B, but B goes back out. And in those inversions, those were characterized by a significantly increased likelihood that the movie that came in and went back out faster was a want movie, and A was a should movie, right? That the documentary sort of sat around because when the want movie came in, it literally jumped the queue and you watched it first. Okay, and actually, people have observed that this actually, for example, the Netflix prize competition, in which people competed to improve Netflix's movie recommendations, actually unfolded right around the time that Netflix was migrating from a mail order company to a instant streaming company over the internet, because the bandwidth around that era had reached the point where you could actually stream to the home reliably. And as a result, a lot of the algorithms trained on the mail order data weren't actually very good in the streaming world, because the mail order data was really a should kind of world, right? It's things that you're like, I bet in 2 days I'm going to want to watch a movie about the font Helvetica. And you move to a streaming world where you can watch anything you want right now, and suddenly the want side takes over, right? And so as a result, models trained in a mail order world, there's no reason to believe that they're necessarily going to be so good in a instant streaming world. And so all of this these field studies in turn build on several lines of work in behavioral economics, on time and consistency, on the notion of sophistication, right? The idea that you're aware of this conflict. And so although that doesn't mean you can solve the conflict, you can at least take steps to try addressing it, right? You can sort of position yourself near the salad. You can order things that you think are going to be good for you in the long run, and so forth. And related to the idea of sophistication, right? The idea that sophistication is the ability to reflect on your own actions. These so-called multiple self models, in which which try to actually discuss that there is a conflict going on between sort of two sides. Okay, so why is this interesting for us if we're trying to build models of social media consumption? Well, because obviously, as these last few examples suggest, a basic question platforms must answer is, what do users want? What are they interested in, right? What movie is it that you're going to want to see? What is it you want to see now? What is it you would want to order for 2 days from now? And right, an enormous amount of data analysis, obviously this is all familiar to all of us, that enormous amount of data analysis, enormous amount of A/B testing experimentation goes into trying to determine the answers to these questions. And a fundamental assumption in all of this is, to draw on one more term from the behavioral science literature, the principle of revealed preference, right? The principle of revealed preference says people choose what they want, so choice reveals preference, right? That I could ask you what you think you might want, but it's hard to find a substitute for seeing what you actually want in the moment. I mean, literally, that's what you wanted, right? And in a way, although the phrase revealed preference doesn't always show up on page 1 of textbooks about recommender systems, or books on analyzing digital traces on online platforms, fundamentally, the fact that studying digital trace data is so powerful is a statement about a belief in revealed preference. We are seeing people's actual choices, and we're going to train models for them. And this is essential for online platforms to function, right? Our point here is not to somehow suggest that we should not be looking at all of this data. Our point, though, is that this data, I think we're increasingly coming to appreciate, is complicated to make sense of. And part of that reason is because of all of the limitations of revealed preference that that these long lines of work in behavioral science have pointed out, right? The limitations of revealed preference are that, in fact, you have internal conflicts. So I'm seeing what part of one side of you want to do, but I'm not necessarily getting an actual snapshot of your entire set of preferences and how they resolved or failed to resolve the conflict that was going on inside you, right? So, in particular, if we, to continue pivoting back and forth between food and media, you're at a party and you really fast eat all the potato chips in the bowl. Now, part of you is sort of hoping the host refills the bowl so there'll be more potato chips, but part of you would love it if the host takes the empty bowl back to the kitchen and doesn't bring it back out, because then you'll be safe from eating any more potato chips, right? But if someone were just looking at your behavioral trace data, it would be, you would have to actually sort of think hard to remember not to simply say they finished a bowl of chips, therefore they like chips, therefore we should provide more chips, right? And the question that we started from is, to think about the way in which user models actually work, and to say, is this fundamentally what's happening online? Is it that I watch you consume a lot of media of a certain type, I decide you must like this kind of media, and I show you a whole bunch more, right? Suddenly your YouTube landing homepage is filled with that kind of video because you watched a bunch of it, right? Is that like the bowl of chips? And if it isn't, to what extent is it not? Okay. That's the, so now, of course, whether you get the right conclusions from revealed preference sort of depends on what is being chosen, right? So you could imagine situations where it would make sense for your host to refill the salad bowl, but for them to take away the empty chips bowl, right? It could be that the kind of food you're consuming might matter. And that surely must be true of online platforms as well, right? That it's not so much, is this revealed preference strategy the right idea or the wrong idea, but rather, when is it the right idea, right? When does it make sense to apply revealed preference to trace data? And when does it not? And how can we possibly tell apart those two kinds of situations, right? Okay, now I'm gonna start moving toward building this model. And we think of it much more as a model of media consumption than food consumption, because the analogy between the two, while very useful to keep in mind, is certainly not perfect, right? It's not just that there's a fixed, inventory of food and platforms simply need to figure out what's what. The online world gives us just infinitely more diversity of content, infinitely more flexibility of design, right? It's really much more when you're on YouTube or Facebook that you're in a billion product grocery store. The shelves are constantly reconfiguring, and new foods are constantly being bioengineered in response to your consumption of food, right? The content is changing nonstop, and there is this feedback loop, right? And this is not to suggest that there isn't a food industry that is constantly innovating, and that it is certainly the case that today's potato chips are different from the potato chips of 5 or 10 years ago. But the cycle time is much slower, right? It is not happening sort of as you're consuming. Whereas in the online world, it's literally happening on a cycle time that's about the same speed as the rate at which you're able to consume. Okay, and that somehow makes this even more complicated. So let's talk about a model. Okay, and so my goals here are sort of on the one hand modest, on the one hand sort of aspirational, right? They're aspirational in the sense that we think this is something that's interesting to try building models of, and it seems like there's really a lot of space to explore here. At the same time, our goals are somewhat modest, in this talk and in this paper the talk is based on, in that we want to sort of see what a model like this would look like, and so we're going to try to do things very simply. We're going to sort of make simple decisions when we can. And in particular, in this talk, especially, I'm going to sort of pick things that I can sort of work through in real time, just so that you can sort of see how some of these work. So the paper has, some more complex versions of what I'll talk about here, but it only really, in a sense, from our point of view, seems to scratch the surface of what's going on. Okay, so building a model of this. So in the spirit of trying to sort of have all the ingredients be as simple as possible, because as we'll see, interesting things happen even then. Let's imagine, there's a user and they're consuming a linear content feed, right? So they are working their way through a Twitter timeline, through their Facebook newsfeed, through a playlist on YouTube, right? Something where the main decision right now is, do you continue to the next item or do you not, right? At what point do you stop scrolling and go do something else? Toward the end of the talk, I'll suggest, what this would look like if, for example, there were a branching component to this, like, there's a YouTube sidebar with like, here are the 10 options for what to watch next. I'll come back to that. But a bunch of things happen even in this world where I'm simply, working my way through, through things on my Twitter timeline, basically trying to decide whether to eat the next potato chip. Okay. And in the spirit of these multiple self models, the user has two sets of preferences, system 1 and system 2. Now, the term system 1, system 2 gets used a lot across economics and the behavioral sciences. We mean it for something extremely specific here, right? So we don't need necessarily to bring in all of the different theoretical infrastructure that's been built around these two terms. We're simply thinking of two competing sets of preferences that exist within the same individual, the user in this case. And in particular, system 1 is numbered 1 because it acts faster, right? So system 1 is the impulsive one. It acts first. And in particular, it acts before, system 2 is able to sort of get up and start doing things. And whereas system 2 is going to be the sort of slower moving, more planning oriented set of preferences. Okay, so we're looking at this sequence of items in your feed, or your timeline. Number t equals 0, 1, 2, and so forth. Item T is going to produce a utility U sub T for system 1, which is drawn from some distribution ID from distribution U. Again, almost everything I say is some decision to make the model simple so that we can see what happens. And obviously all of these we can come back to. Okay, so system 1 really just cares do I want to eat the next chip or not? Is it going to give me positive utility, right? So system one is very focused on the distinction between, positive utility and negative utility. And so if U sub t is positive, it's enjoying the current item, number t, it will continue on t plus one. And let's say, this is some distribution, has some probability of being positive, and let's say it's positive probability p. Right, so p is an important term here. It is the probability that system one is engaged by what it's doing right now, and therefore remains in control to go consume the next thing. Now, if U sub t is less than or equal to 0, then system one temporarily is not engaged. Right? I mean, it might get engaged by the next thing that comes along, but it's not engaged. And so there's a window for system two, right? It hands off control to system two because it doesn't want to act right now. So let's ask, okay, system two, the slower one to rouse, what does it do? All right, so system two uses long range planning. And so when it wakes up at step t, because system one is bored, it looks out ahead across this, feed of content stretching off to infinity. What does it know? It knows its utility for the current item. Now, it doesn't necessarily, right? So system one had utility U sub t, but system two has different preferences. So it has utility V sub t, drawn IID from some distribution script V, with mean V bar. And let's remember mean V bar. That's another important parameter, because that's the average utility that you get from consuming an item, U being system two. I'll also say that in this whole narration, we're going to sort of implicitly take the side of system two, right? All of us are kind of system two, kind of trapped along for the ride as system one risks over consuming, this website that we're on. But we're sort of interested in ultimately, it's system two that's going to look retrospectively on this experience and decide what it thinks. And so we're interested in system two's utility in the long run. Okay, so now system two could leave the site, right? It could decide not to consume and get V sub t. If it leaves, at every step, it has an outside option of capital W. Okay, so imagine there's a cloud floating over every one of these, not just this one, because at any moment, when system two is in control, it can leave, but it has to be in control to decide to leave. Okay, and finally, these items the numbers are grayed out because it knows the value of VT. It only knows that these are drawn from this distribution V. Okay, and that is the planning problem it faces, right? Should I continue on, knowing that I'm drawing from this distribution, giving up this outside option, or should I not? Okay. And remember, it receives control in the middle of item T. System one has decided it's bored, it powers down, hands things off to system two. System two's already gotten the value VT because it's in the middle of consuming this. It's really about whether to go on and down this unknown stream. Okay. Now, as stated, there's something sort of missing from this model that we have to kind of settle, which is if V, which is some kind of principle of diminishing returns has to come here, because V bar, well, okay, if V bar is less than W, then system two has no interest in being on this platform because it would be happier with its outside option than with the expected value of what it's going to consume next. So the question gets interesting when V bar is greater than W. But if V bar is greater than W, we have to ask, what is it that's causing system two to ever want to leave, right? Without some kind of attenuation of this, because these are being drawn IAD, every step looks better to the system two than leaving and getting the outside option because V bar is bigger than W. So any model is going to have to capture the fact that system two will eventually want to leave, right? Imagine there were no system one, right? We can make system one go away by assuming we're in the special case where P equals 0. Remember, P is the probability that system one is engaged. We can always say, let's imagine P equals 0, and then we just have a pure system two problem, right? An agent that can plan ahead, and has a single set of preferences. Why would it ever want to leave if V bar is bigger than W? Well, it has to be one of two things, right? I mean, we all know that we do eventually.
Sorry,
leave,
John.
But yep. Question.
Sorry to interrupt, but I think we have a question.
Sorry for the interruption. I was just trying a little bit. Can we go in the previous slide?
Yeah.
A little bit. I was trying to match the, the structural discussion that we have here with the discussion about the chips and the salad. Yeah. What is the intuition behind the fact that I know the distribution of the future items? I mean, in the real life setting somehow. That
yeah.
What is the intuition about the model? How I know?
So I guess how I'm thinking about it, which is, we're imagining this is sort of system 2 is operating in a relatively homogeneous world. Like it's in the middle of its, say, newsfeed or timeline, right? And so it has some expectation of like, what is the sort of, what is the distribution of reward it gets from the next thing it's going to read as it scrolls through Facebook? Right, it's been on, system 2 has been on Facebook a lot. It's seen a lot of things. And so it has some picture of the distribution. I mean, we could question the independence assumption, obviously. We could, so obviously IAD is a simplification, but in order to engage in this planning activity, system 2 needs some presumption of what it's going to encounter if it stays on the site. And so I think that's right. So this is not system 2 in a sort of unbounded world where anything could happen next. It's system 2 deciding whether to keep scrolling in its timeline. But having said that, of course, the future is unknown, right? This distribution could have enormous variance if you wanted, right? Something you read next could be wonderful. Something you read next could be terrible. That's fine, but it's drawn from your understanding of what you're going to encounter next in your timeline.
But it is parameter free. I mean, do I know the parameters of the distributions, or I mean, I can accept that distribution could have a bounded variance or something like that. But do I know these parameters as the designer, as a player?
Sorry. Well, there's the platform designer and there's the user, right? Currently, all this is all taking place. This is the user, right? Now, the platform designer has a whole separate problem. The platform designer sees clicks, right? They have a big problem in their hands, right? And that's what we would like to get to. Right now, we're just talking about you scrolling through your Facebook newsfeed. You have a sense of what you tend to find in your Facebook newsfeed, right? You have some sense of like what do you tend to encounter next as you keep scrolling. The question of what the platform designer knows, right, is a huge question, because the platform designer basically sees someone just clicking. They keep scrolling and at some point they stop. And that's an extremely limited signal to try drawing conclusions from. So we'll come back to that one. But right now we're just talking about the planning problem that the user is facing as they go through this. Happy to talk more afterwards also. So at some point, the user system 2 is going to want to leave. And so that's either going to happen because they receive diminishing returns from the content, or because the value of the outside option is increasing over time, right? As in, there's V bar and there's W, and either one's going down or one's going up, but they have to cross each other somehow. We've explored a number of ways of doing this, and since they lead to similar things with different levels of sort of complexity, for purposes of doing this real time in the talk, I'm going to go with one of the sort of simpler formulations that we've used, which is, let's imagine that system 2 knows that essentially it's going to remain interested in each step independently with probability Q, right? So as it goes independently with probability Q, it's going to remain interested step by step. And so it's notionally flipping a coin of bias Q. When that coin comes up tails, it feels satisfied, it feels satiated, it's done, and it's going to receive no further utility from being on the site. Right? So system 2's interest undergoes a single on-off transition, which is sort of memoryless starting here, right? It's going to continue to be interested step by step with probability Q independently. And so it knows that the probability will be interested T steps from now is Q to the T. Okay. And this is one way to model the idea that system 2 is getting diminishing value from each new thing it consumes, right? The value it expects to be able to be getting T steps in the future is Q to the T. Okay. All right. And there are a number, we could also have deterministic attenuation of the value. We could have rising value of the W. Fundamentally, these tend to give similar things. Okay. So this probability Q is also an important thing, right? This is, in a world of system 2 in control, say, imagine P equals 0. This is sort of the probability that, the sort of longevity of this content, which is different from the value of this content, right? We can think of things that have instantaneous big value that you only might want to continue for one step, right? That's high V bar, low Q. You can also imagine things that have, medium V bar, high Q, right? So a kind of slow acquisition of utility, right? You can even imagine, conversations can be like this, right? You can have a conversation that, you meet someone in the hall, it's very animated, it's, high V bar, but, you also kind of, the correct length in your mind for this conversation is 2 minutes, you're passing the hall. You also imagine a kind of long conversation that's enjoyable with, medium V bar, high value of Q, right? So the point is there are somehow 3 properties of the content, and we seem to need all of these, right? it sort of feels to us like the sort of small step we were able to think of. There is the value per item, which for system 2 is net value V bar minus W. There's this thing we'll call the span, which is the probability system 2 remains interested per item, which is the longevity of the content, right? Some things you sort of expect to be doing for a long time and getting interest, some things you're doing briefly. And then this term, which we took from the behavioral science work, moorishness, right? Certain items are very moorish, meaning you just impulsively want more, right? Potato chips are moorish. And that's this probability P that system 1 is in control when consuming a piece of content, right? In the sort of dire world where P equals 1, it would mean you are literally trapped because system 1 just wants to keep going forever. Okay, so these 3 things, right? The value of the content, the span for system 2, and the moorishness. And we're interested in system 2's utility for all of this. Okay, so let's actually think about a session that this user does, experiences on this platform, right? And again, the platform has created whatever it created. So far, the platform is somewhere in the background. They have no agency in this story right now. This is about the user and their decisions, knowing what they know about their Twitter timeline, their Facebook newsfeed. What does a session look like from their perspective, right? Because in a way, and let's talk about, the sort of role of system 2 at the entry point, right? The question of, do I want to go on this platform today, right? Do I feel like opening up Facebook right now? That's a system, typically, and we'll actually come back to this point, is typically a system 2 decision, right? You actually have to decide, I'm going to open up Facebook, right? There isn't anything impulsively tempting you at this exact moment. You have to actually make that decision. And so system 2 actually has a big decision at the outset, which is, what is my expected utility from opening up Facebook right now, knowing everything that's going to happen? I'm going to start reading. System 1's going to wake up and drag me along for a while. I'll get back in control. I'll make some decisions. At some point I'll leave and I'll have acquired some utility. And it's traded off against what I could have been doing, not on Facebook, which is this outside option W. Okay. So a session fundamentally, looks like this. It sort of has 2 phases, and the boundary between the phases is determined by when system 2 is satiated, right? When they have reached the point where they're like, I have now consumed all the utility I'm going to consume, right? So satiation for system 2, remember, is, it's flipping a coin of bias Q. And at some point, this discrete on-off switch happens, and it now has decided it is done, it wants to stop. And so the expected length of this first phase is 1 over 1 minus Q, during which system 2 is acquiring value from whatever it consumes. Once that transition happens, system 2 would like to leave. Does it get to leave? Well, not immediately, because the very next thing coming up might impulsively excite system 1, who therefore stays. And system 1 will keep staying as long as it's in control, right? And so system 1 wanting to continue, well, that's a coin flip with bias P, which is continued independently going forward. So that has expected length P over 1 minus P. The 1 versus the P is because it's possible that system 2 decided to go onto Facebook, so they're going to see the first thing no matter what. System 1 might be bored, like we might have the happy coincidence that when system 2 wants to leave, system 1 happens to be not engaged at that moment, and then the length of this phase is actually 0. Okay, so phase 1, system 2 is collecting V bar minus W utility per step over 1 over 1 minus Q steps, and so the expected utility from phase 1 is V bar minus W over 1 minus Q. In phase 2, system 2 has now lost interest, and so it's now collecting minus W utility per step, right? It's experiencing pure opportunity cost for every step it takes because it gets 0 utility. It's getting minus W for every time it's here. But it has to stay there as long as system 1 continues to be interested. And that expected length is P over 1 minus P, right? And this, in a way, is sort of describing, a sort of, a kind of, in technical cartoon form, what we might imagine as a session in which you overconsume, right? You consume a little more than you want. You have a period of regretful use at the end, in which you're getting utility for a while. And at some point, you would you're like, I really should be going, but somehow you can't pull yourself away, right? And that's being personified here as this conflict with system 1, which we should remember system 1 is also you, right? Okay, so that says system 2's utility is a random variable S. And the random variable S is the value it gets from this first phase, V bar minus W over 1 minus Q, minus the opportunity cost it loses from having to stay through the second phase, PW over 1 minus P. And it's the max of this with 0 because system 2 is the one that chose to go on the platform in the first place. So if it knew we were going to get negative expected utility, it would not go on the platform. A key point, actually, right? It says if the platform is providing negative expected utility, system 2 has the ability to not go, right? On the other hand, once you're on the platform, system 1 might drag you along and burn off some of the utility you've acquired. And those are two different things. Okay. And then the length of the session, right? The session length, yep.
I had a question. So, I mean, that last point is interesting because we're talking about how I'm not on TikTok because I'm afraid I would be on TikTok. But can the system 2 interrupt prematurely and say, I think system 1's going to take over soon, and I think this is going to end soon, or they don't have the knowledge or foresight to do that?
They do have knowledge, foresight to do that. Actually, so this is a place where other models we have, which won't fit into this talk, get at this point. So if I go back here, the reason why this sort of works well to kind of all of us, we can do real-time calculations with it, is that this process is memoryless. So every time system 2 wakes up, because it's this IID coin flip, right? It's this geometric distribution. It looks just the same as when it first started. In a world where I was deterministically satiating, right? So imagine a world where like the utility at t steps in is deterministically like q to the t times v, right? So I'm actually deterministically losing utility as I go. That's a different world because then actually the optimal policy for system 2 is to stop slightly early. It's like I'm still enjoying this, but the next time I'm likely to wake up, the next time system 1's likely to hand control over to me, I'm going to have lost more utility than I've gained. And so I should leave now. Like I should sort of leave myself wanting a bit more is actually a good idea. And so in a world of deterministic attenuation, you actually get that reasoning. And it's actually not particularly harder than this to work out, but yeah, it seemed, but that's the difference between the, right? And so it's almost, again, it's crucial to remember these are both you, right? But in a world where we personify these as different people, this is the story of like, system 2 realizes I'm still enjoying the party probably for another few minutes, but I should leave now and I should, convince my friend I came with system 1 to also leave. Because the danger is once system 1 gets dragged into a bunch of conversations, I have to stay at the party longer than I want to, right? Yeah. Is that? Okay, and so the session length is a random variable. That's an easy one in this memoryless model. It's 1 over 1 minus q plus p over 1 minus p, right? And so this is somehow, this pair of equations is actually kind of useful to look at in contrast. Let me put them here in contrast, right? Because they both have a first term that has a denominator 1 minus q and a second term that has a denominator 1 minus p. And so if we think of E of S as utility, how much I value the experience, E of T is the length of time I spent on the platform, right? So let's start kind of bringing in the platform's perspective on this, right? The platform has a hard time figuring out what is your utility. We'll come back to that. The platform does send you surveys, how are you enjoying your YouTube experience today, right? How is Facebook working out for you today? Did you accomplish what you wanted to today on Twitter? But those surveys are rare, right? They're an incredibly narrow signal compared to the voluminous data that they're getting from clicks. But the voluminous data they're getting from clicks is about usage, right? And so, what's in your mind is utility, but what's observable, much more easily observable, is simply the temporal measure, right? Which we could think of as some simple proxy for engagement, right? Obviously, real engagement measures would include things like, how much did you click the like button? How much did you comment when you were there? How many seconds did you watch into the little video clips? All of that's true. But, for keeping the model simple, let's imagine that, the engagement signal here is length of time spent on the platform. So utility, which is what the user cares about, and engagement, which is what the platform can observe, they agree in this first term, right? They're both monotonically increasing in them. Where they disagree is in the second term, where it's negative for utility and positive for engagement, right? Which makes sense, right? System 1 is the wedge that's sort of driving the difference between utility and engagement. Okay, and so what this is telling us is that, when P is 0, then utility is growing monotonically with engagement. So measuring engagement is actually a good proxy for utility, right? In a world without internal conflict in the users, where the user could plan perfectly, right? And there were no potato chips, then in fact, the strategy the platform might have to, let's try to increase engagement, right? We were changing our content around to increase engagement would be a good strategy because as engagement goes up, utility goes up. But if P might range over a large set of possible values, then we're not sure. Long sessions could be a sign of high Q, high utility, or it could be a sign of high values of P, which would actually have a negative effect on utility. And of course, for large enough P, this becomes negative, and the user might not visit the platform at all. So with that in mind, let's think a little bit about the platforms question, right? This has been a story about what's going on inside the user. So let's think about the platform, okay? Now, the problem the platform faces is obviously sort of enormously complex, but let's think about just a few of the ingredients once we have this model in place, right? So the platform's trying to decide what content do I put in your feed, right? As you're scrolling, right? And this is the sense in which, yes, you're consuming food, but it's in a grocery store or a restaurant or at a reception where the food is in a sense being, sort of assembled and reordered as you're consuming. So let's imagine that the platform, can select content from some feasible region in PQV space, right? Let's call this a content manifold, right? So, it could show you, science tutorial videos. It could show you celebrity gossip videos. It could show you, music videos. It could show you documentaries about the Helvetica font. It could show you lots of things, right? It can wander over it can't pick anything from all of PQV space because some things might just be infeasible. But there's some feasible region, okay? So it presents this to the user. It then observes the user's behavior on the platform, including in particular for our model, the session length, which we can think of as, again, this measure of engagement. And for now, let's imagine it can't directly measure user utility, yes. We'll come back to the assumption because there are things like surveys, but let's imagine that, but even surveys are giving us this incredibly minimal signal, right? So we'll think about measuring engagement. And because it makes the problem sort of more intriguing and more challenging, let's imagine that, the platform ultimately would, let's imagine, like to maximize your utility. It just has a communication problem. It can't know your utility. It only knows this engagement value, right? Obviously, it's certainly fine to bring in the idea that the platform might have bad motives. It might, sort of want to sort of just maximize engagement no matter whether you're happy or not. Obviously, that makes the disconnect between utility and engagement even easier to understand. But our point is that even a platform that is making changes that it thinks of as well-intentioned is going to have this challenge. Okay. And so the key question is, if the platform optimizes for engagement, what effect will this have on utility? And what I want to argue, and I'll show you through some worked examples and then a sort of more general theorem, that it's going to depend on the shape of the manifold in PQV space. Okay. In other words, the platform, in a sense, has to figure out, like, does the optimal content look like chips or does it look like salad? Right? If it looks like chips, it should take the bowl away as soon as it's empty. If it looks like salad, it should keep offering you things until you actually stop. Now, for sort of technical reasons, we're going to sort of imagine that this manifold has some kind of implicit parameterization, right? So the platform can't necessarily say, today I'm going to create a video that has this value of P, this value of Q, and this value of V bar. Those are the kind of epiphenomenal properties of the content. Presumably the platform can vary some feature vector X, which it understands about the content, and then that maps to a point in the feasible region. And that parameterizes our manifold. So let's make all this concrete, right? Let's talk about actual content manifolds. And we can work through some examples that are simple enough that we can visualize them. Okay, so maybe the simplest example, just to kind of remind ourselves why we ever thought engagement was a good idea, maximizing engagement was a good idea in the first place. Imagine a world with no system one. Okay, this is just content that does not appeal to system one. And so system two has complete control over the user's behavior when they're on the site. And so the platform has the ability to modify the content along a manifold that's parameterized by some X. And basically this X corresponds to simply making the content better, right? So P is always 0, Q is some base Q naught plus X, V is some V bar is some base V naught plus X. So obviously in this situation, we go back to our pair of equations that govern this. And the optimum for both engagement and utility is to simply increase X as much as possible all the way up to its upper bound at epsilon, right? Engagement goes up, utility goes up. And this is just a reminder that this is why, in a world where we don't think about internal conflict, where we don't worry about system one, we're faced with a relatively easier alignment between engagement and utility. It's actually still not a perfect alignment. I'll come back to that at the end. All right. Second example is sort of a example of sort of, pure trouble, right? This is sort of the purest form of what can go wrong. Imagine that the platform is trying to, create content for users and it discovers it has this lever. It's not quite sure what the lever does, right? But it controls this X. And unbeknownst to the platform, it's basically just making the content more and more Moorish without really changing its appeal at all to system 2. It's just engaging system 1 more and more and more. Okay. And so raising X, well, so as I raise X, I raise P as X. And so what's happening to the utility and the engagement is basically depicted in this plot here, which plots P on the X axis, and orange is the engagement, and blue is the utility. So the more I increase X, utility is just going down because system 2 gets whatever utility it was going to get. But the problem is when it's finally satiated, there's a period during which it can't leave because system 1 is still engaged. And that period is simply growing monotonically in X, and it's just burning up utility. So this is just monotonically decreasing. Engagement is interesting because it's going up, right? Why is it going up? Well, because I'm just varying this term, right? And I'm raising phase 2 of your time there. It goes up really quite sharply until a peak, at which point it abruptly actually just drops to 0. Why is that? Because that was the moment when the user's engagement, the user's utility hit 0. When the user's utility hits 0, they don't go to the platform at all, right? They just know to stay away from it. And as a result, all of that engagement is gone. And so the platform, if it's not thinking about system 1, sees some puzzling behavior, right? It has this lever and it begins moving the lever. And people are more and more engaged. And this seems great, longer and longer sessions, right? And so, when you meet to review your metrics, you're like, this is looking good. We're getting longer, users are more and more engaged. And then you suddenly find that, users who were very, very engaged suddenly just abruptly stop showing up, right? And what's happened, of course, is that you sort of missed the fact that you were heading toward this, you were driving the system toward a cliff, right? And that cliff was where system 2 finally sort of wrests back control in this internal conflict and never goes to the platform level, right? In the process, you've actually burned up all of the utility in the system. Now, these two examples, example 1, example 2, it's never quite this simple, right? And, when you, obviously, when you talk to people who, work with, producing content for platforms, they're like, in particular, it's not this simple because the same things that make system 1 crave more tend to make the content actually more enjoyable, right? Like these two things are correlated. So a third example, is that, reality presumably looks sort of something more like this, right? So an example where these properties are correlated, right? So again, the platform discovers it has this lever and it can vary the content by moving this lever. It increases the Moorishness and it also increases the quality. Just to keep too much complexity out of this, let's just assume Q stays constant, although Q is welcome to move also in other examples, right? So what's going to happen here? Here, utility will have an internal maximum, right? As you increase Moorishness, utility goes up for a while because the content is getting better, and the increase in content quality is temporarily outweighing the loss, the opportunity cost from sort of having to stay on longer at the end when you sort of overconsume, right? And so it says, when we think about things like regretful use, like let's survey people about, how much time did you want to spend? How much time did you spend? Oh, that gap is regretful use. We should remember that for most real situations, the correct amount of regretful use is probably not 0, because the same aspects of content that are making you, use it regretfully at the very end are also causing some of the enjoyment, which is why you're going on the platform in the first place. But of course, the problem is if I'm optimizing for pure engagement, I wouldn't know to stop at this global maximum of utility. I would, if I'm only able to measure engagement, keep going, again, driving myself toward this cliff where I've burned off all of the utility, right? So this is sort of where what we're learning is that, is engagement a good signal for utility? Well, it can actually vary. On part of the manifold, it's a good signal. And on part of the manifold, it's actually a bad signal, right? And part of the challenge is to actually, figure out which is which. Now, we can create many, many more examples just by mixtures, right? So if I have, K sources I can draw from, and I'm like, I'm going to populate your feed by selecting randomly from these sources, then what I could do is just say, okay, I'm going to have mixing weights, X1 to XK, where I'm going to have, every time I put something into your feed, I'm going to draw from source I independently with probability XI. And so these are my K features that, that are the coordinate system for the manifold that produce this, tuple of PQV. And so the result is a content feed with just this weighted average of parameters. And, for example, the previous example that we had could be viewed as simply a mixture of two simple sources, right? One that's kind of dull, but has no system one problems, where you can leave anytime you want. And one that's, supremely addictive, but is higher quality, right? And by finding the right way to mix, right? So if I mix in too much of this ingredient, I end up with zero utility and the user knows to stay away. But if I mix in the right amount, I can actually get better utility. And actually, this mixture formulation lets us think about other design choices, right? So for example, to sort of bring up a first sort of example of a design choice, adding breaks, right? So we've seen more and more, including TikTok, including Instagram, like platforms saying, you can turn something on where it actually enforces a break. Like, okay, time to take a break, right? Adding breaks, intuitively seems like a good idea because, oh, good, this reminded me I have to leave. Behaviorally, it's saying it allows system 2 to take control and decide, do I still want to be here? And within our model, it basically says we're creating a mixture model in which we have one more content source with parameters 0, system 1's not engaged, some value of Q, and 0 quality. Like a break isn't intrinsically interesting. But despite that, you can create examples, not unlike the one we saw last, where the user doesn't want to go on the platform. And then I mix in an amount of this break genre, which has no quality whatsoever. And now the user is willing to use it and actually gets positive utility from the system, right? Because they know that predictably, they'll be able to retake control of system 2 and not burn off all of the utility that would have come. Okay, so actually adding breaks can induce a user in this model, as in real life, to visit a platform and they wouldn't have otherwise. Okay, I see I'm nearing the end of my time. Let me tell you one general result, and then I'll just wrap up with some thoughts and happy to take more questions. So it's interesting to actually ask, can we characterize the structure of manifolds where, engagement optimum is utility optimum? Or can we characterize the subset of a manifold where engagement is growing monotonically in utility? And all of these seem like really interesting open questions to us. I'll tell you sort of one general statement that we're able to make, but it feels like there's much more that's possible to do here, which is, let's think about, the manifold is some compact subset of PQV space. So it's a subset of this ambient space. Let's imagine, for any point omega, which is this triple, we have the expected utility and expected engagement. Let's imagine the point that achieves the optimal utility, the point that achieves the optimal engagement, omega S and omega T, S for utility, T for engagement. We have all that. And so here's something at the bottom, which is a general statement that we can say. Suppose that the engagement optimum, suppose we're in one of these bad situations, right? In which the optimum for engagement, omega T, produces strictly higher engagement and strictly lower utility than the optimum for utility. Okay, then in fact, that can only happen for one of two reasons, right? One of two things must hold. Either the Moorishness at the engagement optimum is indeed higher than the Moorishness at the utility optimum, as in the platform has made a mistake by showing content that's too Moorish, right? That attracts system 1 too much. Or if you actually work out, the result, you discover that's not the only reason. There's a second reason. It could be that at the engagement optimum, there's longer span and lower quality. This one was interesting to us because it's purely a system 2 statement, right? It sort of came out of the analysis of this. And we looked at this, and it actually, of course, is something that you also hear about in online platforms, even though we sort of weren't looking to build this in, but it's here. It's a statement purely about system 2. It says that the example is search engines sometimes find that they have accidentally induced sort of more engagement on the search engine because their search results got worse, right? If I'm trying to find something on a search engine, then the ideal experience is that I look and the first result I want is correct. I click through and I'm gone, right? So search is something where I would like to get enormous quality and very short span. I want to be gone immediately. And if the search results get a bit worse, the user is there for longer, but that's actually worse utility for them. It has nothing to do with system 1. It's actually this conjunction of things. It's that now they're more likely to keep going because they still need the answer to their question. And they're getting lower value for each step that they take. They're still staying on. They're choosing to go there because the net utility is positive. But it's less than it would have been had I been able to greatly increase the quality and reduce the span. And so it turns out these are, in a sense, the only two reasons within this model why engagement is a bad proxy for utility. One is because of system 1 too aggressively taking over. And one is because of this low quality search results problem that you have span that's too long, but with worse quality. Okay, so this sort of gives the architecture of this model that we've begun sort of thinking about and experimenting with. As you can see, there's a a lot more one could possibly do. I just wanted to wrap up with some sort of final reflections, right? So this all starts from the sense that platform optimization from behavioral data is one of the sort of fundamental pillars of how modern social media works. It's hard to say that it's the wrong thing to do. This is the data they have, and this is sort of what they can infer. But it certainly says we need to proceed carefully, right? That something is, and in particular, proceeding carefully, we're arguing, is about realizing that revealed preference is not sort of the whole story here, right? And so to try explicitly modeling the inconsistent preferences, and thereby at least telling us something that we can learn here, right? And this links to, again, as I mentioned, a lot of things, to digital addiction, to online commitment devices, to this recent line of work on value alignment, for example, right? Trying to build the values of, it's sort of building systems that embody the values of what the user wants to get out of it. It also provides us a lot of ways to think about design choices in the platform. And I'll just sort of list a bunch of ones that we've talked about, right? How to interpret the data that we collect, the fact there's a conflict, the role of surveys, as a way of getting directly at utility, the number of options to display, which I don't have time in this talk, but the fact that we were working with a linear content feed, but other models we have include branching. This idea that preview versus autoplay, right? Autoplay is somehow lowering the cost of system one and increasing the Moorishness. The benefits of enforced breaks, which adds cost to system one and therefore makes system two get in control more and potentially makes the platform actually more enticing despite nothing happening. And even things that I haven't had a chance to talk about here, but that are kind of intriguing, right? Even the idea that system two is in control of the initial decision to go on the platform, right? I could just stay away from TikTok completely. Gives you an interesting way to think about embedded media, right? So perhaps you rationally stay away from YouTube because you burn too much time there, but you do read the Washington Post. And the problem is the Washington Post sometimes ambushes you because midway through an article, they're like, this was nicely captured in this clever YouTube clip, check it out. And there it is. And it just starts playing. And you had wanted to stay away from YouTube, but you were reading the Washington Post. And once it starts playing, system one is in control, right? And now system one is just going and you're burning up utility, right? And so in a sense, embedded media, right? Sticking the YouTube clip directly in the article, right? Sticking the embedded tweet directly in the article when you didn't want to go on Twitter is, in a sense, and I think, it's often not articulated this way, but it's fundamentally doing this. It's a way of somehow sort of directly porting system one's judgment into the situation, right? And so my argument here is that, this is giving us a way of thinking about a lot of design choices in terms of this internal conflict. We're often seeing surprises. I think there's a lot here that's obviously to be worked out. These are very, very simple models for incredibly complicated situations, but our hope is that it's giving at least sort of some additional vocabulary for talking about something that has, over the past 10 years or so been very, very hard to talk about in any sort of concrete way. And so I think that leads to some interesting opportunities for discussion going forward. Thanks very much.
Thank you, John, for the very interesting talk. Questions? Yes.
Thank you, John, again for the very inspiring talk, I would say. I would like to ask an open-ended question. I would like to understand a little bit how we can put in this model a little bit the factor of privacy. In one sense that, and I think that there are two different ways that I would like to see it. Let's say that I am the user and let's say that I am the platform. If I am the user and always in privacy, it is where I will put the trusted barrier. So if I am the user, how we can put in the model somehow? I wouldn't like to inform the model about my utility, but on the other hand, I don't know how I should not give data to the system. And I mean, what we can do, let's say from the local DP, if I apply it as a user, or from central DP, if I apply it as the platform, probably. That is one question that I would like to hear your opinion.
Yeah, thanks. It's a great question, of course, and I won't claim to have an answer to it, but it's something we've thought some about. I mean, so here's a couple of thoughts. So on the centralized side, it's interesting to ask sort of how far a platform could get with aggregate data, right? Aggregate data of the form that I might try to, apply some principles of differential privacy or something too. And I say that in the sense that each user's preferences are, of course, idiosyncratic to them, but there are obviously certain regularities, right? So, in the case of food, for example, there's a reason why I can put up chips and salad as examples, and it at least hopefully resonates with some of you in the audience. It's because, there are certain empirical regularities in what food, we tend to overconsume. There are certain empirical regularities in what kind of media we tend to overconsume. And so the hope is that actually we can make a lot of progress on this by analyzing data in aggregate, where potentially like your presence or absence in the data is not actually the decisive factor. That won't capture all of the idiosyncratic ways in which your preferences differ from everyone else's, but it would at least, one would expect, sort of address much of this. Now, on the client side, right? So you as the user might have, as you said, like local information, and you could imagine, app side things, client side applications, where what you're doing is sort of building some kind of model of situations where you tend to overconsume, where this is kind of doing some kind of learning, where this is, this data is only accessible to you. And it's sort of interesting to think about, what can we do looking at your past behavior, looking at sort of where you overconsume? To what extent could that become a kind of predictive guide to sort of steer you away from those situations? These are sort of two things that we've thought about, one on the kind of centralized aggregate data side, one on the sort of local user-facing side where it can be their data. But it would be interesting to think about, other opportunities, other options for sort of merging ideas from privacy into this.
Hey, I have another question. By the way, thanks. That was a fascinating talk. So my question was about how you elicit P, Q, and V naught in the real world. It seems like a causal inference kind of issue where you don't know whether the person giving feedback is in system 1 or system 2. So do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, so we've looked a little bit at some of these. So some things that we've thought about in this context. So one is, there's a belief. So first, let's talk about surveys, because surveys are interesting things because there's a belief in the sort of world of online platforms that it tends to be system 2 that answers surveys, right? Like system 1 tends not to be what, the part of you that reflects on your past experience and evaluates it. So to the extent that we're at least getting a stronger mixture of system 2 in the answers to surveys, you could, of course, sort of intervene at certain points and ask, are you satisfied right now? That has a couple of things. First of all, it actually introduces a break into your consumption for whatever that's worth, and it also elicits that answer from you. One thing that we, so there are a couple kinds of surveys that you might find interesting, that might be relevant. One is a kind of regretful use survey, right? Where you ask someone in advance, how long are you intending to spend on the platform? And then you measure how long they did spend on the platform. And that gap, you could potentially say, okay, that is the period of time during which system 1 was in control, which gives us some insight into the parameters that are governing system 2 in this particular genre on this particular platform. A second kind of survey is simply a measure of satisfaction. And one thing that the model suggests, which is quite intriguing, is that the answer you give to the survey might actually vary over the course of your session, and also might vary with the total length of your session, right? So if I ask you at the end of your session, what did you think? The answer you might give at the end of a long session might be different from the answer you give at the end of a short session. And it appears that in things that are kind of more, content's more like salad, your survey answers you would expect to actually increase monotonically with the length of the session. The longer session actually would give higher survey results. In things that are more like potato chips, again, at least within the model, you'd expect that actually the survey results would be worse at the end of long sessions and short sessions. So another thing that we've been intrigued by is the possibility that actually looking at correlations between survey responses as a function of session length might also give us some insight into this. And a third one, which I'll just say briefly, is heterogeneity of participants, right? So, in these pictures, we're showing like, engagement goes up until it falls off a cliff. But of course, each user has slightly different parameters. Each user has, even if users had identical content parameters, they have slightly different outside options. And so you will actually see people begin to leave gradually. And so some other signals that seem to actually begin getting at some of these parameters that are hard to infer are, for example, the divergence between fraction of users willing to participate, and length of session. And one warning sign is when those two begin to go in opposite directions. So you have fewer and fewer users on the system for longer and longer periods of time when they join. And so I think looking at the divergence of those also. So these are the kinds of things that we're thinking about, right? Taking various invariants of the system that we can measure. And when there are multiple of them, asking, when they move in different directions, does that tell us something about the movement of these parameters? And in some cases, it seems like there might be some signaling.
I have a slightly different kind of question. I think I'm interested in whether there is any empirical evidence on whether people choose to engage based on system 2, because I don't know, in at least in my own mental model, I think of people like hopping on Twitter or Instagram, like when they're on the bus, when they're not really, they're bored, it's kind of habitual, right? Like it's not, I don't necessarily think that it's like a super calculated set of decisions. And I'm willing to be wrong about that. That's totally a folk theory.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a great question. So, I mean, we see some, some examples where, so what are some of these studies? I mean, so studies in which, for example, I look at sort of how much I have to pay you to give up social media, for example, and then look at the effects of that, looking at social media usage, exactly as you say, in situations where the outside option is higher or lower, right? So on the bus is a perfect example because like your outside option, which is to stare out the bus window, seems very low. So you're sort of like, okay, there's a genuinely different calculation going on there. And so people sort of looked at these as a way of trying to figure out how much a component of planning is going on in social media usage. But I think it's actually, to a large extent, an open question, to what extent can we map the decision to go on the platform to a pure system 2 decision. And again, my point at the very end about embedded media also says that, the way in which the content shows up is can also be sort of something which actually lowers the barrier to you joining, right? And in some sense, like as we thought about that example of the YouTube clip embedded in the Washington Post article, you see analogies to that actually in the food domain, right? So it's many of us have not been passing through airports as much as we used to, but if you think back to passing through an airport, the place that sells the cinnamon rolls that are high calorie, delicious, very system 1 appealing, you might know to kind of rush past those because that if you stop, you might buy one and that would be a terrible idea. But they know to pipe the smell of the cinnamon roll out into the concourse, right? The smell is actually wafting all around that kiosk that's selling it because what they're trying to do is wake up system 1, right? They want system 1 to already be eating the cinnamon roll effectively as you're walking down the concourse. And so that's another place in which we can sort of look at the extent to which there's planning or not in these situations, of like creating these different situations in which system 1 might be more or less activated. But all of this is sort of, a relatively wide open empirical area to figure out sort of what are the kind of conditions under which we could try to get some of these insights.
Any more questions?
Very nice talk. Oh, loud. Very nice talk. You already touched upon this, but I was wondering if you thought about under what sort of models could you test like how far away system 1 and system 2 are from each other? So just like based on, you have a number of observations of how long people have been using the system and when they drop off, when could you, under what assumptions and how many samples would you start to need to be able to figure out if there were actually 2 at play that were very different?
Yeah, it's a nice question. And I guess part of it would be, is it from purely observational session length data? Do I get other things like survey data? Do I get heterogeneity? I think all of those are going to affect things. In cases where I can sort of ask you predictive questions about how long you hope to stay, that's perhaps the easiest setting because then there's almost sort of this gap that I can try to solve for. In cases where there's user heterogeneity, right, it would sort of, the more variation there is in the population, the more I can potentially get some of these things. But yeah, I think these are sort of interesting. So the way we've thought about it has been sort of like, what extra information do we have at our disposal? In the sort of pure engagement question, I feel like the question sort of has to be like, what else do I know? Because if I literally simply tell you've moved this variable, users are spending longer, I can't really know, have I increased P or increased Q, for example. And so it's often a question like, what else am I combining it with? And that's often with something designed to elicit information like a survey or something designed to create divergences between people like heterogeneity.
Okay, I think that's it. Let's thank John once again for the very exciting talk.
Thanks very much.